Judge Samuel Cooper had spent over 2 decades in the courtroom. His name was known far and wide as a man of unshakable principles, a man who followed the law without question. It was a reputation that had earned him respect from his peers and fear from those who stood before him. Yet today, something felt different. As he called the next case, he looked down at the defendant's name, Rachel Williams. His eyes scanned her file. She was being charged with driving without a valid license. She was a single mother trying to make ends meet. Her record showed a history of minor infractions, yet nothing that screamed trouble, just a woman caught in the grind of life, trying to keep her head above water. Rachel stood nervously at the podium, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her worn jacket. Her eyes flickered between the judge and the floor. She had been through this before, the cold stares, the indifferent words of authority. But today was different. This fine was something she simply couldn't afford. She had been trying to pay off her debts since her car had broken down 2 months ago. And now this one more thing to pile onto the ever-growing list of struggles. She hadn't expected sympathy, but perhaps some understanding, some recognition of how hard she had worked just to make it this far. Judge Cooper's voice broke her thoughts as he began speaking with a stern tone. He told her that she had been driving illegally and that the law required a fine. He handed her the paper with the amount owed and dismissed her with the usual finality. His words felt like an iron door closing on her future. She tried to swallow the lump in her throat. As she nodded and turned to leave the courtroom, the sound of her footsteps echoed in the silence of the room. It felt heavier than usual, as if she was carrying the weight of an unjust world on her shoulders. Rachel had never felt so invisible. She had been taught to keep her head down and just survive. But in moments like this, when no one seemed to care, it was hard not to question the fairness of it all. The doors of the courthouse opened before her, and the cool breeze hit her face. It felt like freedom for just a moment, but it quickly turned to defeat. The fine would add to her growing list of debts. She wondered if she would ever catch a break. She looked back at the courthouse, a part of her hoping for some kind of sign, but it was just a building, just a place where people's lives were weighed and measured without ever understanding what they truly meant. As Rachel walked down the steps, she caught a glimpse of the judge standing in the doorway. He wasn't looking at her, but the way the sunlight caught his face made her pause. She couldn't help but wonder what kind of man he really was. Did he understand what it was like to be her, or was he just another part of the system that didn't care? Rachel shook her head, trying to push away the thoughts. She had bigger things to worry about. But somehow, that fleeting moment stayed with her. As she walked away, her mind racing with questions and doubts she couldn't shake. Rachel returned to her hectic life, trying to shake off the weight of the courtroom and the judge's stern face still lingering in her thoughts. Every time she closed her eyes, her mind would flash back to that moment when the fine was handed down, as though it were an anchor pulling her deeper into the sea of her struggles. She had 2 kids to care for and no time to waste on the unfairness of it all. But the fine felt different. It wasn't just about the money, it was about being judged, as if her whole life could be summed up in a few moments in front of a judge who barely seemed to notice her pain or her effort to survive. Still, Rachel wasn't one to dwell for long. She didn't have that luxury. She had 2 kids to feed and bills that never stopped coming. In the next few days passed in a blur of work and errands. But when Rachel finally found a quiet moment, she opened her phone. She needed a break from the constant grind of reality. Maybe a distraction would help. Maybe she could find something that would make her feel less alone in the struggle. Scrolling through her feed, she saw a post from someone she hadn't expected to see. A post from Judge Samuel Cooper, the man who had just fined her. It was a long message about racial inequality and the struggles of marginalized communities. It was raw and unfiltered, unlike the stern and distant judge she had seen in court. He talked about recognizing his own privilege and the biases that had shaped his decisions over the years. For the first time, Rachel saw a glimpse of the man behind the robe, and the words caught her off guard. She had expected to see the same cold and calculating figure she had met in court, but instead she saw someone willing to confront the flaws within himself. Something about it made Rachel pause. She had lived with this sense that the system was stacked against people like her, but here was a man admitting that it wasn't just about the law, it was about the biases that influenced those who upheld it. Rachel was skeptical. Of course, she had been burned by promises of change before, but something in Cooper's words made her feel a spark of hope. She felt this strange desire to know more, to understand whether this man who had once judged her so harshly was truly seeking to change, or if this was just another form of lip service. Still, curiosity tugged at her, and she clicked the follow button without much thought. As she continued to scroll through his posts over the next few days, she found herself reading more and more of his reflections. He talked about white privilege, the flaws in the legal system, and how those who had power needed to be held accountable. He didn't have all the answers, but there was a sincerity in his words that made Rachel feel like maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something different. She hadn't expected to find herself interested in the words of a man who had once been a symbol of authority over her life, but here she was unable to look away, feeling an urge to understand him better, to understand if this was real or just another story designed to keep her in place. It was hard to trust, but it was harder to ignore the possibility that maybe, just maybe, he was finally seeing the truth. As the days passed, Rachel found herself returning to Judge Cooper's posts more often. Each time, his words seemed to resonate with her deeper than the last. He wasn't just talking about the problems within the system. He was examining his own role within it, admitting the ways in which he had upheld those problems unknowingly. It wasn't just talk. There was a sense of self-awareness that made Rachel feel like he was truly searching for answers. She began to read his posts with a new sense of curiosity, wondering if this man was genuinely trying to evolve or if he was just playing it reformed for the sake of his image. One night, as she sat on the edge of her bed after tucking her children in, Rachel found herself typing a response to one of his more recent posts. He had shared an article about racial biases in sentencing, detailing how judges, despite their best intentions, could unknowingly enforce racial disparities. It was exactly the kind of thing Rachel had experienced firsthand. Her mind raced as she typed, unsure whether her words would have any real impact, but feeling compelled to speak her truth. "I see what you're saying," Rachel wrote, "but change doesn't come just from understanding the problem. It's about making things right, about using your position to actually help people who have been harmed by this system. We need more than words. We need actions that match them." She stared at the message for a long time, unsure if it was too direct or too confrontational. But then, with a deep breath, she hit send. Almost immediately, she regretted it. What if he just ignored it? What if he dismissed her as another angry person venting on the internet? To her surprise, Judge Cooper replied within the hour. "You're right," he wrote, "and I'll be the first to admit that words aren't easy. But I'm trying to figure out what comes next. I want to do more than just acknowledge the issue. I want to make it better. Maybe we can talk about how that looks from your perspective." Rachel sat back stunned. She had expected a quick dismissal or even a defensive response, but instead, he was asking her for her thoughts, for her guidance. A sense of caution crept in. Was he just trying to pacify her, to make her feel heard without really changing anything? But the sincerity in his reply made her hesitate, made her wonder if this could be the beginning of something real. Over the next few days, they exchanged more messages. At first, Rachel was hesitant, unsure of how much to reveal. She told him about her struggles as a single mother, the way she had felt trapped by the system, how her fines, her record, her life seemed like a series of obstacles stacked against her. She explained how she had never felt seen or understood by people like him, people who wielded the power to make decisions that could impact her future. And Judge Cooper listened. He didn't just offer quick fixes or platitudes. He asked questions, sought to understand, and admitted that he didn't have all the answers. But with each exchange, Rachel began to see a shift in him. He wasn't just talking about change anymore. He was listening to her, really listening. By the end of the week, Rachel had convinced herself that there was something authentic in their conversation, something that set it apart from the countless other times she'd been promised change. She had no illusions that one person could fix everything, but for the first time in a long while, Rachel felt a sense of possibility. Maybe this wasn't just another judge who didn't understand. Maybe, just maybe, this was someone who was willing to try. As the days passed, Rachel found herself returning to Judge Cooper's posts more often. Each time, his words seemed to resonate with her deeper than the last. He wasn't just talking about the problems within the system. He was examining his own role within it, admitting the ways in which he had upheld those problems unknowingly. It wasn't just talk. There was a sense of self-awareness that made Rachel feel like he was truly searching for answers. She began to read his posts with a new sense of curiosity, wondering if this man was genuinely trying to evolve, or if he was just playing it reformed for the sake of his image. One night, as she sat on the edge of her bed after tucking her children in, Rachel found herself typing a response to one of his more recent posts. He had shared an article about racial biases in sentencing, detailing how judges, despite their best intentions, could unknowingly enforce racial disparities. It was exactly the kind of thing Rachel had experienced firsthand. Her mind raced as she typed, unsure whether her words would have any real impact, but feeling compelled to speak her truth. "I see what you're saying," Rachel wrote, "but change doesn't come just from understanding the problem. It's about making things right, about using your position to actually help people who have been harmed by this system. We need more than words. We need actions that match them." She stared at the message for a long time, unsure if it was too direct or too confrontational. But then, with a deep breath, she hit send. Almost immediately, she regretted it. What if he just ignored it? What if he dismissed her as another angry person venting on the internet? To her surprise, Judge Cooper replied within the hour. "You're right," he wrote, "and I'll be the first to admit that words are easy, but I'm trying to figure out what comes next. I want to do more than just acknowledge the issue. I want to make it better. Maybe we can talk about how that looks from your perspective." Rachel sat back stunned. She had expected a quick dismissal or even a defensive response, but instead, he was asking her for her thoughts, for her guidance. A sense of caution crept in. Was he just trying to pacify her, to make her feel heard without really changing anything? But the sincerity in his reply made her hesitate, made her wonder if this could be the beginning of something real. Over the next few days, they exchanged more messages. At first, Rachel was hesitant, unsure of how much to reveal. She told him about her struggles as a single mother, the way she had felt trapped by the system, how her fines, her record, her life seemed like a series of obstacles stacked against her. She explained how she had never felt seen or understood by people like him, people who wielded the power to make decisions that could impact her future. And Judge Cooper listened. He didn't just offer quick fixes or platitudes. He asked questions, sought to understand, and admitted that he didn't have all the answers. But with each exchange, Rachel began to see a shift in him. He wasn't just talking about change anymore. He was listening to her, really listening. By the end of the week, Rachel had convinced herself that there was something authentic in their conversation, something that set it apart from the countless other times she'd been promised change. She had no illusions that one person could fix everything, but for the first time in a long while, Rachel felt a sense of possibility. Maybe this wasn't just another judge who didn't understand. Maybe, just maybe, this was someone who was willing to try. The days following their brief conversation at the community event were a blur for both Rachel and Judge Cooper. For Rachel, there was a quiet sense of disbelief. She had been waiting for something, some spark of real change, but she couldn't help wondering if this moment was just a fleeting encounter that would soon fade away. Judge Cooper's words, his genuine tone, stuck with her. "I need help," he had said. It wasn't a common thing to hear from someone like him. But as much as she wanted to believe in his sincerity, Rachel had been burned before by people who promised change and delivered nothing. Cooper, on the other hand, couldn't shake the thought of Rachel in their conversation. After years of feeling confident in his position, he now found himself questioning everything he had known about justice and his role in it. The encounter with Rachel had been a turning point. Her words had forced him to look at his past decisions with a critical eye, something he had never done before. In his private moments, he found himself replaying the moment when he handed her the fine, her nervousness palpable, her frustration barely contained. He realized that what he had seen as a minor violation was far more complicated in the context of her life. Sitting in his office late one evening, Cooper sifted through old cases, some of which had involved black defendants. He looked at the sentences he had handed down, the fines, the judgments, and he saw a pattern. The people who looked like Rachel, the ones who didn't have the resources or the support, often ended up with harsher penalties. They were stuck in a cycle of debt and punishment, while others, with privilege and money, seemed to get away with far less. He had never seen it so clearly before. It was as if a veil had been lifted from his eyes, and he suddenly understood how deeply embedded racial biases were within the system he had always believed to be fair. He began reading everything he could find about racial inequality in the legal system. He sought out experts, attended webinars, and reached out to colleagues who had worked with marginalized communities. He knew he couldn't just apologize and hope things would change. That wasn't enough. He needed to actively work to undo the harm he had contributed to, and he needed guidance from the people who had lived the reality of it. Then, one evening, after another long day of reading and reflecting, Cooper sent Rachel a message. He didn't expect her to respond right away, but he couldn't wait any longer. He was ready to take the next step, even if it meant confronting his own discomfort and guilt. Rachel, his message began, "I've been thinking about what you said, and I want to do more than just talk. I want to be part of a real solution. I've started to educate myself more on the systemic issues we've discussed, and I realize that I can't do this alone. I need to listen to voices like yours, voices that have been ignored for too long. If you're willing, I'd like to meet and discuss how we can move forward together. I believe we can make a real difference." Rachel read his message late at night, her mind racing. She hadn't expected this, an actual invitation to work together. For a moment, doubt crept in. Was he just trying to check off a box? Or did he genuinely want to understand her perspective and make meaningful change? But something in his message felt different. It wasn't an apology for his actions. It was a recognition that he had been part of the problem and that he was now asking for her help to be part of the solution. Taking a deep breath, Rachel responded, her fingers hovering over the keyboard for a moment. She had every reason to be skeptical, every reason to walk away from this offer. But something told her that this moment, this small spark, could lead to something bigger. She couldn't ignore the possibility of real change. "I'm willing to talk," she typed, "but we need to make sure we're serious about this. Actions, not just words. Let's meet." As she hit send, Rachel felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like she might be able to make a difference, not just for herself, but for others who had been harmed by a system that didn't see them as human. And for the first time in a long while, she felt a small, quiet sense of hope. The meeting between Rachel and Judge Cooper was set for a few days later at a local cafe known for its quiet atmosphere and warm, welcoming vibe. It was a neutral ground, far from the courtroom, far from the world of legal jargon and judgments. Rachel wasn't sure what to expect, but she was nervous. The idea of sitting across from the man who would find her, the man whose decisions had impacted her life, felt surreal. Would he continue to show the sincerity he had expressed online? Or was this just another way for him to ease his conscience without really changing anything? When she arrived at the cafe, she found him already seated at a small table by the window. Judge Cooper didn't look like a judge today. He was wearing a casual jacket and slacks, his tie long abandoned. He looked different, more like a man who was trying to understand his own place in the world, rather than one who was simply imposing his authority. Rachel hesitated for a moment at the door, her nerves almost getting the best of her. But then she took a deep breath and walked over to the table. "Rachel," he said, standing as she approached. His voice was warm but nervous, as if he was just as unsure about this meeting as she was. "I'm glad you could make it." Rachel nodded and sat down. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she studied him, trying to gauge whether he was truly ready to listen or if this was just another performance. Judge Cooper's eyes met hers, and there was a vulnerability in them that caught her off guard. It wasn't the stern gaze of the man who had sentenced people to jail time. It wasn't the detached look of someone who was above the world of the people in his courtroom. It was the look of a man who had started to realize just how much he didn't know. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," Cooper began, his voice hesitant, "about the things we've discussed, about the biases I've seen in myself, in the system I've helped uphold." Rachel's heart tightened as she listened. She had expected some sort of explanation, a defense, but there was none of that in his voice. There was only an acknowledgement of his own ignorance and an openness to change. She couldn't deny that it made her feel something she hadn't felt in years when dealing with people in power, respect. Good, she said after a long pause. Because that's the first step. But now we need to talk about what comes next. It's not enough to admit the problem. You need to take action. You need to work with people who know what it feels like to be on the other side of the law, people who've lived through the system's failures. Cooper nodded, his brow furrowed in concentration. I want to understand. I want to hear your perspective. What should the system look like if it were fair? How do we start fixing it? Rachel paused, surprised by his directness. He wasn't asking to be taught in a way that felt like charity. He was asking because he genuinely wanted to know. And for the first time, she felt like he wasn't just doing this for his own redemption. He was doing it because he saw the need for change. First, we need to stop treating people like numbers, Rachel said slowly, her voice steady but firm. We need to stop looking at people based on their race, their income, or their background and assuming we know their entire story. We need to see people for who they are, not just as cases to be closed. Cooper leaned forward, his hands clasped in front of him as he listened intently. What else? He asked quietly. Rachel took a deep breath. You need to listen, and I mean really listen, not just when it's convenient or when it fits the narrative you want. The voices of those who've been harmed have to be heard in every decision that gets made. And if you really want to change, you'll need to use your power to create policies that make the system more just, not just sit in your office signing rulings that continue to harm people. There was a long silence between them. Cooper seemed to take her words to heart, considering them carefully, as if he understood that the path to real change wasn't just a matter of being sorry. It was about using his position to effect tangible change, not just from behind a desk, but by engaging with the communities who had been left behind by the system. I want to make this right, he said quietly. But I need you to help me understand how. Rachel looked at him, her gaze unwavering. I'll help, she said after a moment. But we have to be willing to push through the discomfort and keep going. There's no easy way around it. It'll be hard, but it'll be worth it. For the first time in a long while, Rachel felt like they might actually be on the verge of something important. It wasn't going to be easy, but maybe, just maybe, they could make a difference together. The weeks following Rachel and Judge Cooper's meeting were a whirlwind. They began to communicate regularly, exchanging ideas, articles, and thoughts on reform. What started as a tentative collaboration soon gained momentum as they both realized how much they could learn from each other. Judge Cooper started attending local community meetings, listening to those who had been directly impacted by the legal system, while Rachel began researching policy changes that could make a real difference for people like her. Their conversations were raw, often uncomfortable, but always constructive. Both of them were aware of the uphill battle they faced, but the sense of purpose that had emerged from their initial meeting gave them both hope. One day, as Rachel sat at her kitchen table reviewing some notes, her phone buzzed with a message from Cooper. It was a link to a recent article about a new initiative in a neighboring city aimed at reducing racial disparities in sentencing by promoting restorative justice practices. Cooper's message was simple, but it made Rachel's heart race. What do you think? Could this work here? Rachel studied the article, her mind racing with possibilities. Restorative justice was a concept she had heard of, but never fully understood until now. The idea of focusing on healing, rather than punishment, seemed like the kind of change they had both been pushing for. It was a model that prioritized accountability, but also empathy and understanding. The more Rachel read, the more she believed that this could be the key to breaking the cycle of injustice that had haunted her and so many others. She responded quickly, I think it's worth exploring. It might be exactly what we need to start changing things in this system, but it'll require a lot of people to get on board, especially the ones in power. Cooper replied within minutes. I'm meeting with a few colleagues tomorrow to discuss it. I want you to come. I want you to speak. This isn't just my fight. It's ours. The invitation sent a shock of disbelief through Rachel. She had no idea if she was ready to speak to a room full of legal professionals and policymakers, but she knew this was a chance she couldn't pass up. The thought of standing up and sharing her story, of making her voice heard in the very room where decisions that affected her life were made, was both empowering and terrifying. But Rachel had come too far to turn back now. The next day, she dressed carefully, choosing clothes that made her feel strong and confident, yet grounded. As she entered the meeting room, she noticed the tension in the air. Several judges, attorneys, and local lawmakers were gathered, and they all seemed to be exchanging cautious glances. Rachel's presence was a statement. There was no going back now. When Cooper stood to introduce the discussion, his words were honest, vulnerable, and unexpectedly humble. "I've invited Rachel here today because I believe her voice needs to be heard," he said. "We've been discussing the flaws of the system, and I want you all to hear firsthand from someone who has lived through it. Her experience isn't isolated. It's one shared by many who don't have the resources or the opportunity to change their circumstances. Rachel, thank you for being here. We're listening." Rachel stood up slowly, the weight of his words settling in her chest. She took a deep breath and began to speak, her voice steady but raw. "I've lived my whole life thinking that the system was designed to punish people like me," she said, her eyes scanning the room. "I've faced fines, criminal charges, and more, all because I couldn't afford to fight back. The system is stacked against people who don't have the money, the influence, or the privilege. I'm here because I want to see that change." For the next 10 minutes, Rachel shared her story, the struggles of single motherhood, the toll of being unfairly judged, and the pain of trying to survive within a system that seemed more interested in punishing her than helping her. She didn't hold back. She talked about the financial strain, the emotional toll, and the anger she had felt when she was treated as less than human in the courtroom. But she also spoke about hope, the hope that systems could be rebuilt, that there could be justice for people like her. When she finished, there was a heavy silence in the room. For a moment, Rachel wasn't sure what to expect. Would they see her as just another angry person, or had her words made an impact? Judge Cooper broke the silence. "This," he said, "is the reality we need to face. Rachel's story is not unique. It's the story of so many others who are lost in a broken system. We need to change that." The room, once filled with skepticism, seemed to shift. There were murmurs of agreement, a few nods. For the first time in a long while, Rachel felt a sense of unity, a sense that they might actually be able to build something together. It wouldn't be easy, and the road ahead would be long, but something was happening. Something had shifted. That day, for the first time, Rachel felt like she was no longer alone in her fight, and neither was Judge Cooper. They were in this together now, fighting not just for themselves, but for everyone whose voices had been silenced for too long. The weeks after Rachel's testimony felt like a turning point, not just for her, but for the entire community. The room where she had stood in front of judges, attorneys, and lawmakers became a symbol of something new, something real. Judge Cooper took the initiative to ensure that her story wasn't just a momentary lapse of attention. He pushed for policy discussions about restorative justice, held meetings with the local bar association, and began making calls to national organizations that had successfully implemented similar models. The momentum was building, slowly but surely. Rachel, too, felt a shift within herself. She wasn't the same woman who had walked into that cafe months ago, unsure if anything would change. Her voice had grown stronger, her resolve clearer. She had seen firsthand that change could happen, even when it seemed impossible, and she knew that the road wasn't over yet. It was only just beginning. One day, as Rachel was walking home from work, she received a call from Cooper. "Rachel," he said, his voice sounding more excited than usual. "We've been working on something big. The City Council is willing to pilot a restorative justice program in a few select neighborhoods, yours included, but we need your help to make it official." Rachel stopped in her tracks, disbelief flooding her. "What do you mean? Are you saying they're actually going to try it? After everything we've talked about?" "I'm saying they're ready to listen," Cooper said. "They want you to speak again, this time at the City Council meeting. If we get their approval, we can start implementing restorative justice practices. This is it, Rachel. We can finally make a real difference." Rachel's heart raced as she stood on the sidewalk, looking up at the sky, as if trying to make sense of what she had just heard. The system she had always thought was beyond repair was beginning to bend towards something more just. It wasn't just a dream anymore, it was a possibility. The council meeting was scheduled for the following week, and Rachel knew it was her chance to cement the progress they had made. She spent the next several days preparing not just her speech, but her heart. She knew that this moment was bigger than her. It wasn't just about one woman's struggle, it was about the future for so many others who had been denied a fair chance. When the day arrived, Rachel walked into the council chamber with Cooper by her side. The room was filled with officials, journalists, and members of the public, all waiting to hear what she had to say. She had never felt more nervous in her life, but she also felt a deep sense of purpose. As she approached the podium, the room fell silent. She could feel the weight of the moment, but she took a steadying breath and began. "Good evening," she began, her voice strong but steady. "My name is Rachel. I'm here tonight to speak about something that has affected me, my family, and so many others in our community. The justice system isn't always just. It has a history of punishing those who can't afford to fight back, and it's been a system that has left too many of us feeling forgotten, overlooked, and unheard. But I stand here today to say that we have the power to change that." As she spoke, she saw the faces in the crowd, some of them skeptical, others hopeful, all of them listening. Her voice grew more confident with each word, because she wasn't speaking just for herself anymore. She was speaking for everyone who had been marginalized, ignored, and punished for no other reason than circumstance. "We have the power to build a system that doesn't just punish, but heals," she continued. "Restorative justice isn't just a theory. It's a practice that can rebuild relationships, restore communities, and give people a chance to make things right. We can make this happen. We can make it happen together." Rachel's words hung in the air, and for a moment, there was silence. The council members exchanged glances, and she held her breath, waiting for the response. Finally, the mayor spoke up, his voice calm but firm. "Thank you, Rachel. We hear you, and we're ready to take the next steps." A ripple of applause echoed through the chamber. The council had agreed to the pilot program. It wasn't the end of the battle, but it was a victory, a powerful one that sent a clear message. The voices of the marginalized were finally being heard, and change was no longer just a dream. Rachel looked over at Cooper, who was smiling with pride. She had come a long way since that first day in his courtroom, but they had both learned that sometimes the most unlikely partnerships can create the most lasting change. As Rachel stepped away from the podium, she felt a sense of hope flood through her. There was still so much work to do, but for the first time in her life, she truly believed that justice wasn't something to be feared. It was something to be fought for, and together, they would continue fighting.